I love the peace faking term, because we do have that temptation, don't we, to fake peace. Whether you're conflict avoidant, whether you decide that, okay, I'm going to keep my mouth shut and just let him have his way, and even though I'm hurt, I'm not going to talk about it. Those little hurts just tend to accumulate, and they end up with bitterness, and bitterness leads to resentment, and then if the conflict isn't really resolved, we end up in a place of contempt.
Today on the show, we have Carey and Toni Nieuwhof. Carey needs no introduction. He is a well-known author, thought leader for the church, former church planter and pastor, and a prominent voice in evangelical life. Toni wrote a book called Before You Split and was a divorce lawyer and a pharmacist prior to being a pastor's wife. So they are a fascinating couple. And today, we talk about their marriage and how in 2006, they hit a wall. Carey hit complete burnout. She was depressed. And some of the big changes they needed to make to be able to breathe again.
Yeah, we also had an interesting conversation about the difference of peacemaking and peace faking that Toni had some really great things to say about.
So with that, let's jump right in. Here's our conversation with Toni and Carey Nieuwhof. Carey, from the outside looking in, you're one of the leading thought leaders in the church today. I really believe that. Many people look to your blog and to your information as kind of where it's headed. You were successful to plant a church in one of the most difficult places in North America. From the outside, it seems like the Nieuwhofs have figured it out. But my hunch is there's been a lot of pain in your guys' story too. So maybe you guys could open up a little bit about what happened and where your marriage is today.
I think the Nieuwhofs are figuring it out. I think that's a good way to describe it, Ben. We definitely have gone through some super challenging seasons. I think, when you get married, I met Toni when I was 23, married when I was 25, which is maybe a little older than some of the audience or younger than some of the audience, but you just have no idea who you are, what baggage you're bringing into the marriage. And I show up as a very driven, I thought, lawyer. Like when we started dating, that was my path. And then in the middle of, really just before we got engaged, I sensed a call into ministry for the first time and ended up finishing law, had a lot of dreams and ambitions for law that I put on hold, and then went into seminary. And, in the first decade of church leadership was really blessed to see some small dying churches turn around, but that came largely, I think God was moving. This is one of the great mysteries. Like, I think a lot of people became Christians. It wasn't all bad fruit. There are some people who are walking with Jesus today, and we reached a lot of people for Jesus. But that came because I didn't have an off switch, in part. I didn't have any good boundaries. So Toni ended up marrying a workaholic, not an alcoholic. And it's really confusing. You love Jesus, he's your Lord. You're working at the church. I'd never been part of a church once we got past 200, which took a couple of years. I'd never been part of a church that big, had no idea how to lead one. And I did not have good boundaries. And we were starting to move toward the end of that decade into a tenser period of our marriage. And it was just easier for me to stay at work or keep the laptop open than it was to engage the issues at home. So that all led up to a big crash of mine in 2006. 11 years after starting at the churches, I burned out. And that was a big reset point to my life. But that's sort of I would say there were two things that defined that first decade. Workaholism, but even worse than that, and maybe what drives the workaholism, performance addiction. How big is big enough? How good was that sermon? How much better can I be as a leader? And this is all pre-social media. I mean, the train derailed in 2006. So, but it was a nasty beast that I had to come to terms with.
Toni, were you working during that time as a lawyer, or were you helping at the church? I mean, what was your story at that time?
Early in the church, I volunteered. So we had a 3-point charge. There were 3 small churches that banded together for survival, basically. They hired a student pastor, and I jumped in with 2 feet. It's foolish, really, in retrospect, but I tried to do everything. So I was kids ministry leader times 3. I was doing music ministry times 3. I was involved in the special events, and
we had a newborn.
Yeah, I was working part-time. Obviously, I wasn't working full-time and then all of that volunteer work on top. But still, I was probably working about 20 hours a week outside of our house, and then volunteering at the church. At the beginning, Carey was away because he was studying in Toronto. So he was away 3 days a week. Wow. So, yeah, we hit the ground running and really bit off more than we could chew.
Yeah, and the pay was great too, so that added no stress to our relationship. It was, I don't know that it was above the poverty line. It was pretty close at those little churches. And then when I graduated, they called me as their full-time pastor. But at that time, you were working. Toni was a pharmacist before she's a lawyer, so you're working in pharmacy in those years because it fits more neatly into a box than law does. But still, I mean, that was a lot of work.
Until our youngest son went to kindergarten, at which point I went back and finished my law licensing process.
Well, hey, let's jump in at 2006. What happened there? What caused the crash? Because there's a lot of folks out there probably wondering if they're on the edge of burnout.
Well, from the pastors I talked to, the answer to that question would be yes, there are a lot of leaders. And, you know, the Barna stat, 42%. Of people in the end of 2022 or early 2022 were thinking of leaving ministry. For me, there was not really a precipitous event. There wasn't. In fact, the irony was I was probably on top of the world. It was May of 2006. I'd gotten to know some people at North Point and got invited to speak to 2,500 church leaders at a big conference at North Point. And I thought it was like the Super Bowl of my life. Like Andy Stanley's in the front row. Reggie Joyner is there, who invited me. I was speaking to 2,500 leaders in a packed out auditorium. And apparently the talk went really well. You were there. The boys were there. North Point was generous enough to fly everybody down. And I left feeling like I was on top of the world. But it had been after a decade of burning the candle at both ends, of not having good boundaries, of the tension in our marriage rising. And we flew back from Atlanta to Toronto, and when the plane landed, it's like I fell off a cliff as soon as I got off the plane. And I didn't know what it was for about a month and a half. I was tired. I lost all motivation. I lost all my energy. I was exhausted. I was very emotional. And you know, ministry, which had been driving me my entire decade leading up to that, just wasn't interesting anymore. Nothing was interesting. Food wasn't interesting. People weren't interesting. I got some phobias. Like, you know, years earlier I had said as the church grew, I think I'm peopled out. But it got to a paranoid level where, you know, I'm 6'2", Toni's 5'3". There's about 100 pounds between us, 100 and then some. And I was hiding behind her at social gatherings so I wouldn't have to talk to people. Like it was ridiculous. And, you know, by the summer I figured out, oh, you're burned out. This is what it looks like. And I'd been tired before, but the thing that made a burnout for me anyway was not only the accumulation of symptoms, it was the inability to get back. When you're tired, you go to bed, you wake up, you feel better. You take a weekend off, you take a week off, you take a vacation. I took 3 weeks off in the summer of 2006 and I didn't get better, I got worse. And I'm like, oh, I'm in a bad place right now. And I didn't know, frankly, it was so bad, I didn't know whether I could go back to ministry. I didn't leave. I took like 3 weeks off, but I thought maybe this is the end of the road for me, and I was barely 40.
I'd like to know what Toni was thinking through all that. What were you saying to Carey during that time?
That was a tough season, Ben. Carey was in burnout. We didn't know exactly what it was, but certainly recognized the struggle. Yeah. I was diagnosed with depression around that same time. So I think I was dysthymic, you know, the subclinical form of depression, before I actually became depressed fully in the fall of 2006. So as far as thoughts go, it was a survival season for us. I think, if anything, it made us each a little more compassionate toward each other.
You were very compassionate toward me.
We had gone through a long struggle with conflict, and workaholism was part of it, but my own tendencies to be socially isolated, to not develop a community, not to really dive into community and use a network as you need to be a part of. I think all of that was almost a perfect storm. Wow. So I think day to day, my thoughts were pretty preoccupied with just how can we get through the next hour? And what do we need to do for the kids? And also I think that was the start of a more compassionate view toward each other, where we were really looking at how we could help the other person make it through that day.
You were very compassionate toward me, but probably you'd never seen me that broken before.
No, I think it was a bit shocking for both of us to land with poor mental health at the same time with young kids and responsible positions. It did feel like a perfect storm.
So for the listener out there, how does depression and burnout look different? Like, how do you know when you're in one but not the other?
I would say if I'd gone for a diagnosis in the summer of 2006, like by July or August of 2006, it started in May, they probably would have diagnosed me as clinically depressed and maybe put me on some antidepressants. Now, I kind of figured I wasn't depressed because I didn't have a history. Like maybe I was depressed, but I didn't think, and listen, I'm not opposed to people taking medication for mental illness and depression. I think that's perfectly fine and consistent with Christian faith. I didn't want to do it. And the reason I didn't want to do it is I didn't think it was a chemical imbalance. I think it was a life imbalance. I think I had gotten myself to the point where I led myself into this pit, and that I didn't know the way out. But I remember my counselor that summer. I was seeing a counselor, and he said, "Carey, you will get through this. You will get out of it. But remember how you feel, because most people won't get out of it. Some people don't get out of it." And I remember by September, the first little bit of light, the shaft of light broke through, and I felt some passion for the mission of our church again and some excitement for the future. I remember laughing for the first time in 2 or 3 months, and I'm like, oh, okay, there's a break in the storm. And then it gradually came back. So there probably was an overlap. I probably was clinically depressed. But for me, I kind of thought, okay, I got here fairly quickly. I think I might be able to get out. But if it had continued, I probably would have ended up on medication.
So how do you guys counsel or encourage couples that are burning the candle at both ends? They're both just mentally spent. They don't feel called to leave their church. Like, what do you tell them? What are the steps to get healthy again?
That's what I've spent my last decade doing.
Talk about the last decade.
This is my passion. No, you know what? Like, it took me 3 to 5 years, because once you burn out, you wouldn't wish it on a worst enemy. But I took 3 to 5 years. It was so painful. I just thought, I never want to go back. I never want to burn out. And by the grace of God, 16 years later, I haven't burned out. I've been tired. I've been exhausted. I've been frustrated, but I haven't been burned out. And I realized the rhythms of my life were fundamentally flawed. That I had no boundaries. And I also realized time is limited. Nobody's going to hand me an eighth day. Nobody is going to give me an extra hour in a day. I am responsible for using my time. So I started to manage my time, but I was pretty decent at time management even before I burned out, which seems stupid, but I was. It was energy management. And I realized I have 3 to 5 hours in a day, and I have to manage those really well. And rather than filling them with breakfast meetings, I'm going to write my sermon, because that's the eater. If you're listening, like, it eats your time. It eats your Thursday nights, your Fridays, your Saturdays. If you're not done. So Monday, I started working on my sermon in the morning, because I'm a morning person. And then usually by Tuesday, it was finished. And then I started working ahead. And you know this from ministry. If you have your sermon done, the sky can fall on Wednesday. You can handle it. But if the sky's falling on Wednesday and you haven't even thought about what you're going to preach on Sunday, goodbye weekend, goodbye kids, goodbye wife. I started to prioritize my sleep, my diet. I started exercising. So the short answer is you're living at an unsustainable pace. Like if you're burning out right now, what got you there is probably you're overwhelmed, you're overworked, and you're overcommitted. And what you have to do is and everyone says, oh, I'll take a vacation. I'll just, we're going to the beach. We're going to the Caribbean. We're going to Europe. We're going camping. We're going to the mountains. We're going to the ocean. That'll heal me. Time off won't heal you when the problem is how you spend time on. And if you're spending your time on in a way that is unsustainable, you can take a month off. This is why sabbaticals don't work for most people, is they go in burned out. They have this amazing time, wherever in the mountains, and they come down feeling totally refreshed. And by 11 a.m. of their first day back, they're exhausted because they haven't addressed the fundamental rhythm of their life. So what I've been doing is totally transforming our rhythm, my rhythm. And now I'm able to lead 10, 100x, I don't know, a lot more than I did before. And we just moved to a 4-day work week in my company, and I just came off 3 days off. And, I'm working 30, maybe 40, 45 hours a week and impacting millions of people around the world. And we have time for each other. We were out on the boat on the weekend. We threw a big dinner party Sunday after church yesterday.
I wonder what Lindley was thinking while you were saying all that.
Well, I was thinking, how do you realize what you're doing well and what you're not doing well? Because, I know we never had a sabbatical in 17 years. And I'm kind of bummed about that, but I'm like, I don't know that we would have used it well, because the way we were burning the candle at both ends, I think, because we've done that before. We've gone on vacation, and almost the minute we land back in the city that we were from at that time, it was like, I'm tired. Like, I'm just tired thinking about what I'm about to do.
I know. I saw the building. I saw the church, and I'm exhausted already. I don't even have to go in.
So, did you guys do this together? Do you talk about it together? Like, hey, because Ben and I are so honest with each other. I can just say, that sounds like a good meeting in theory, but it's really not. Like, I know you. It's not going to be a good idea.
I think we definitely went through an era of trial and error to get things right. I feel like people can learn more from what we did wrong than what we did right. But eventually, we learned that we had to be so very intentional with our time and strategic with how we planned our calendars. So, for example, and how to not burn the candle at both ends. We looked at our kids' rhythms and our calendars and decided, okay, from 4 till 8 in the afternoon, we need to carve out family time. So it meant even in a season of leadership for Carey that he was leaving work at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Walking out of meetings, telling people, I told you I had till 3:30. I'm leaving this meeting right now, and I'm walking out mid-sentence, because otherwise Children's Aid is going to go pick up my kids, and I'll be in jail. So I'm realized
that for the sake of our marriage and for our kids, we needed to protect that time frame within our day, 4 until 8. That was a season when the kids were in elementary school, so it changed when the kids were teenagers. I think the other thing that we recognized was that even though we had said that we need to have date time, we need to have time away for our marriage, we would often allow our family business, the business things that you have to talk about, parenting decisions and so on, we would allow that to encroach on our time when we're supposed to be connecting and
date
talking
night.
about
date
our
night
emotions
is logistics
and
night.
Growing closer, but we were actually allowing this family business to boil over into arguments. So
it's so easy to do.
Fight night.
Yeah. It's so easy to do. It happened to us even this weekend. On Saturday morning, I woke up hungry for college football and zero work talk. And we honestly just hadn't talked about this interview or the one we have after this. And so Lindley wanted to talk about Glass House stuff. And I was like, can we please not talk about work stuff? But
that went well.
Yeah, it was a great weekend. But at the same time, it's hard to find those times to sort stuff out as a couple, so it's really easy to take your personal time and give it to work.
Well, what happened is that we had a rare Saturday morning where all 3 boys were home, and we knew they would sleep till 10 or 10:30. And so I'm thinking we never have time uninterrupted or not in our vehicle or something, just with their ages. And so we need to use this time now and then enjoy them when they wake up. But he just was like, I want to read a book. I want to watch College Game Day. Like, this is not the time. And I disagreed fully. Let's talk about burnout.
Let's do.
Addressing the issue behind the burnout.
I can relate to the problem of coming back into town and the cloud of depression sitting on top of the vehicle as we come into the city limits of the city in which we serve, knowing all those rhythms and exhausting ways are about to jump right back into our life.
Right. I mean, I think it was so interesting how he was describing that we could be gone for a month, but if we don't address some of the issues, that we're going to come right back into the same problems. And I know you and I have done this. I mean, we'll go on a week-long vacation. We've done this to Cancun. And on the last day, you and I look at each other kind of in a stressed out way of, well, do we go ahead and open the inbox now and start knocking out some of these emails, or do we wait? Because either way, it's going to be bad. And we always end up doing it while on vacation, like checking the inbox while on vacation. And so, I mean, even that is just signs and symptoms that we just really don't have a good control over, rest.
And I think addressing the deeper issue, which is the value of work. It's not just the behavior at work, but the value of work. You are overvaluing work when it is taking up the vast majority of your energy. And I was convicted to hear them talk about 3 to 5 hours of energy per day. I think most of us think about having 10 hours of energy a day. Maybe we slow down at evening time. But the reality is good, creative, positive energy, there's a limited supply. And if you're coming back to a situation after vacation where you're going to be taxing that supply on a daily basis, psychologically, nobody wants that life. So how do you do it?
Well, I mean, I've asked you this before because I'm not a morning person, so getting up super early is not my problem. But you get up at, 4:45, 5 a.m. a lot of mornings and work several hours before 8 a.m., and then you still expect yourself to have a full day, 8 to 4, 8 to 5. I mean, I've had to ask you before, like, where do you make changes if you're going to start 3 hours earlier?
And I don't even think about it that way. Like, if I start at 4:45 and stop at 4:45, I don't think about that being a 12-hour day because it's only 4:45. So if you have a workaholic tendency, there's always this temptation to squeeze in a little more work, to respond to a little bit more email, to go ahead and knock out a call right here while my kid's riding down the road with me. There's just always that temptation to squeeze in more.
Well, I asked you last week one day, I said, it was 4 o'clock on one day, and I said, I'm going to go do something. And you said, well, do you want me to go with you? Or, there's always more I can do here. And I think even that mindset of there's always more I can do, and I'm picking on you here because I don't have a formal job that is requiring email pretty often. I did the same thing at Storyline. But I think that is where our mentality is broken, and that it's like there's always going to be more.
Back to your earlier question, though, because I think it's a great one. How does someone know that they're managing their time on well? So I have a little litmus test that I've used for over a decade now, and it's a question. Am I living in a way today that will help me thrive tomorrow? Plain and simple. And if the answer to that is no, every day the answer to that is no, you get a step closer to burnout. I'll give you a very practical example. So these days, 7 years ago, I became the founding pastor of our church, handed things off to the next generation. I do a lot of speaking on the road, writing courses. I lead something called the Art of Leadership Academy, do the podcast that I do, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a speaking engagement where I'm in Tennessee, and I've got to be at Ramsey to do chapel, I think on the Wednesday, and then Monday, Tuesday, I'm in the east part of the state in a city I forget. It's near Knoxville. So anyway, long story short, we're negotiating this last week with my assistant, and she's like, yeah, you're speaking on Monday night and Tuesday breakfast, and then Tuesday lunch and Tuesday afternoon. And then there's a 3.5 hour drive to Nashville, and then you're up in Franklin on Wednesday morning. And I'm like, I'm going to be roadkill by like, I know I am. I know how I behave in those certain situations. When I speak, I leave it all out there, and I'm going to be roadkill. Yep. So we looked at like flights between Knoxville and and Franklin, like Nashville, and they don't exist, or you have to go through, I don't know, Idaho to get there or something. It's weird. So I'm like, well, get me a driver. So it's weird. It sounds pretentious, but I'm like, I'm getting someone to drive me from one city to the other so I can veg out in the back seat. I can sleep if I want to, and I show up rested the next day. And you know what? It was a couple $100 more than renting a car and driving myself into the ground while I'm at it and performing poorly the next morning. So diet, sleep, exercise, like right down to, okay, I'm going to get driven 3.5 hours rather than driving it myself, because I know after 2 days, 3 days of speaking, I'm a disaster. So it's knowing myself. And old me, I would have pushed through, probably done okay at the event, and then come home and collapsed. And then who gets all of the collateral damage of you pushing all your boundaries? It's the people that are supposed to have the best experience of you, your wife and kids.
Right.
So it's like, no, I want to show up rested for Toni.
I leave it all out there when I speak too, and so Lindley gets to pay the bill a lot when I get home. I get home and I'm just like lethargic for 2 days, and she's like, "You are not speaking back to back again. That's it."
But it's recognizing that, like, and I've trained my team in this system, and you know it, and you adopt it in ways for your own life. But it's like, yeah, as much as that's a great opportunity, we can't do it. I'm already on the road twice this month. I'm going to stay home. I'm better that way.
The principle that Carey's talking about there is just knowing yourself, whether it's hiring a driver to take you places or knowing that the Sunday after Easter, I am always exhausted. So this year, I'm not going to do it. No matter how many times they try to tell me that I'm going to preach the Sunday after Easter, I'm going to get a guest speaker the Sunday after Easter.
Right.
I think it's just knowing where your energy lands. And as you're in ministry year after year, you begin to predict your highs and lows.
Right. Somebody we interviewed talked about having bookend situations. You know, if they knew they were coming into a busy season, making sure there's some rest before and after. And I agree with not everyone has the ability to hire a driver. A lot of people live in a tiny town, so there's not even a lot you can do in regards to, we talked about having groceries delivered. Well, you may not live in a town that has that ability, but just knowing what is energizing, what is not energizing. They talked about living in your green zone, which we know is like living in your strengths. So I think it takes a lot of self-reflection to realize what is energizing to me and what is draining to me, and writing those down as you do it, and then saying, I need to live more in this. But I mean, I know you had that pressure every year that someone said, well, we came on Easter, my friend came back the next Sunday and you weren't preaching. And, it like heaped shame on you that, you were so human that you couldn't preach a second weekend in a row. But why?
That's where the congregation is never going to prioritize your needs. They're going to prioritize their own. That's human nature. Mm-hmm. But I think as we get older, especially, I'm 46 now, not 29 when I started preaching, I can't recover as quickly as I used to when I speak, especially if I go to a conference and I speak at night, and then I do a morning session, then a panel, and then one more breakout session before I hop the plane. If I do all that within a 24-hour span of time, when I hit that airplane on the way home, I am exhausted. And then when I get home, I'm even more exhausted because planes exhaust me.
Right.
And so knowing that I can't come back from a trip like that and have a day full of meetings.
We just wrote an article about this. And one thing that is funny about you exhausting is that conversation when standing up makes you more tired than having conversation with people while you're sitting down.
100%.
And so like a church is all like standing up afterwards, mingling. When you go speak at conferences, the hardest thing for you is that it's all introductory conversations. Every person is new. You don't have any relationships with them. So it's extra draining for you versus, being in your congregation at the fellowship hall on Wednesday night for the family meal. That's different.
Well, this just happened. We had a street party and everybody was standing up talking, and I was literally feeling my battery draining every minute I was standing there talking. But then I saw a bunch of fold-out chairs, and I went over and sat down next to a guy, and we had the best conversation sitting. Mm-hmm. So for me, just knowing myself, I love small talking and catching up with people, but not standing up. I don't know what it is. So I think learning yourself and the things that drain you and taking good care of yourself is really the principle there.
Can I ask your opinion on something? We have a lot of listeners who we've got feedback that they're basically the only staff in their church. And so when you talk about you guys made a decision that between 4 and 8, it's really going to be family time, how would you advise these pastors when they have a small town church member or something that says, I need you to come to the hospital and see my family member, or I need you to do this or that at 5 p.m., and they just feel pressure. I mean, they're the only staff person, and so it's hard to say, no, I can't do that because I need to be with my family. Like, what do you say there?
So I'd love your take on this, but I was solo staff for 3 years, and then for another 2 years, so up to 5 years, I only had an assistant, and the assistant did not do house calls. And these were churches that really, at the time, those 3 little churches, which have now become Connexus Church in a totally different model, but we're used to chaplains, basically, people to come and hold your hand. So I'm very familiar with that. I didn't do a good job then, and that's what created some of the problems. But if I was doing it now, and this is what I do now, I mean, I say no every single day to all kinds of opportunities. What I would do now, if I was starting over again, is you just tell people, and I eventually got there because the alternative just about killed me, is I'm not available. And I don't know what you do with all your inboxes, et cetera, because people are probably texting you and Facebook messaging you and DMing you on Instagram day in and day out. But work has to fit into a container. Now, there's a car accident, or there's a child that's dying, or the chair of your elder board is dying. You go at 5 o'clock. I've done those calls, but 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, a child isn't dying, a chair of the board isn't dying, and there's no emergency. Like somebody comes to you and says, my marriage is a mess, I need you to see you at 5 o'clock. Well, your marriage didn't become a mess today at lunch. It's been a mess for a long time, right? Like, it's not like, oh, we had the best marriage ever, and then we had this bad lunch, and now we're getting divorced at dinner. It's like, no, this took a long time. So what you can do, that time was convenient for them. It doesn't have to be convenient for you. What you say is, I would love to meet with you. How is Thursday at 1 o'clock? Like, pick a spot when you're available. And if you think this doesn't work, when my book, At Your Best, which shares a lot of these principles, came out, I got invited by some New York realtors, the Corcoran Group, Barbara Corcoran from Shark Tank, her company. They wanted me to coach them on At Your Best. And I'm like, oh man, I've never sold a house in my life, like from that perspective of a realtor. And they're running 24/7 because they have showings and everything. And they're stressed out and burned out. And it's New York City. I mean, the game doesn't get a lot bigger than that.
Right.
And so I'm on this call with them and I'm coaching them through it. And I'm like, so tell me about it. Could you say, I just want to run this by you. Oh, you know what? I love to meet with you. I'm doing showings Tuesday from noon till 2. And I'm doing walkthroughs Wednesday from 3 till 5. What time works best for you? They're like, yeah, that would work. How many of you are doing it? Nobody put their hand up. And they're like, I think that just solved most of our problem. Because we're reactive, right? We're reactive. It's like, you said it was convenient for you, but you do that every dinner. You got no meals with your family. One of our goals at that time was dinner together as a family 5 days a week. And I moved heaven and earth to be home 5 days a week with our kids. Now, sometimes that was a 3-minute meal, particularly raising 2 sons. You know that. I'm done. Okay, off to hockey, off to baseball. But we did that.
You have talked about not having boundaries as a reason that people burn out, but I believe another cause is unresolved conflict. And Toni, I think you've done a lot of work on peacemaking, and Lindley and I came across Ken Sande's work on the peacemaker, and he always talked about the difference between peace faking and peacemaking and how draining peace faking can be. So what have you learned over the years about helping people get free and clear of the unresolved conflicts in life that keep bringing them down to the gutter?
Oh, that's such a big question. We could spend so many podcasts talking about this. But I love the peace faking term, because we do have that temptation, don't we, to fake peace. So, whether you're conflict avoidant, whether you decide that, okay, I'm going to keep my mouth shut and just let him have his way. And, even though I'm hurt, I'm not going to talk about it. Those little hurts just tend to accumulate, and they accumulate, and then we end up with bitterness, and bitterness leads to resentment. And then if we're not careful, if the conflict isn't really resolved, we end up in a place of contempt, which Dr. John Gottman says, that is one of the markers, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So I think in answer to your question, what I've learned about peacemaking is that we all tend to tell ourselves victim stories. And once you've been with your partner for a while, you know what their weaknesses are. You each know each other's weaknesses. You can end up having a very unidimensional view of what's going on. So, for example, if I pick on Carey's workaholism, there was a season where I just felt completely exhausted, and all of our conflict seemed to revolve around our schedule and our calendars and not getting things done and managing our household tasks. And so in that season, I said, I'm so exhausted, and it's because Carey is working so many hours. He's out so much, I can't cope. And so I'm exhausted. It's all Carey's fault. And meanwhile, Carey has his own version of a victim story, which I think went something like, Toni is not doing X, Y, and Z. She's not really picking up her share of the responsibilities at home. I'm a victim of her laziness. And we each had our own story, but the reality was that, there was a kernel of truth. Carey was working too many hours. I was also, not completely engaged with helping get things accomplished in the evening. I think out of my stress, I just defaulted to playing with the kids and, choosing comfort over taking responsibility. I think that was a season, to be honest. But we each had our unidimensional view of this dynamic, and it didn't help. So you need to clarify that view and see how it is that I'm telling myself a victim story, and what part of this complex situation, this complex conflict, in most cases it is actually complex, what part of it is mine? What's my role? And even if you think it's only maybe 5% or 10%, take your small percentage, I don't care what number you attach to it, and focus on that rather than focusing on what you perceive your partner's weakness to be.
I love this idea of a victim story. I'm trying to figure out what mine is because I totally resonate with that.
Well, it goes back. There was a question dropped in the chat about when work equals ministry. A lot of pastors are like, well, I'd love to draw boundaries, but my church has these expectations. And you can become the victim of that, saying, well, that's great, Carey, that you were in a church that allowed you to say, no, I'm not coming to the hospital right now, or I'm going to come on my own schedule. But eventually I even said, pastoral care happens in groups. I don't do it. And what you have to do, what I found, is you have to train your church. And I had to train the church. Like, we went through vision casting moments where I said, right now, I'm the pastor of all of you. If we're really going to reach the entire community, I can't do that anymore. Either I'm going to burn out, and this was long before I burned out, or, we're just going to stop growing. I've read the research on this. So you have to learn how to care for each other. Now, did we do that handoff perfectly? No. I said initially, okay, elders, we'll divide you into districts and you can do pastoral care. And that got vetoed at meeting 1. So much for that idea. And then we tried small groups, and we didn't do it well for a few years. But what that allowed me to do was to focus on vision, aligning the team, hiring a team, getting better at preaching, getting my reps in, and the church kept growing. And, by the time I handed the reins over at Connexus, and it was 3,000 or 4,000 people, I didn't know the names of 70% of the people who went to our church. I didn't know the names of over half of our volunteers. And I go to church sometimes and I feel like, wow, look at all these strangers I get to worship with. But there are still people from like the 90s that are still around that I had the chance to serve. And we catch up like it's old times. But that's what allows things to scale. In the same way now, It's like we have to say no. I say no to 98% of the requests that come our way, whether it's speaking, podcast interviews, et cetera, et cetera. Because if I said yes, I wouldn't be able to do my own podcast, write articles, or write books. Like I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So, your boundaries really determine it. And do I disappoint people? Yeah. But hopefully you get to a point where you're reaching a lot of people and people can see the growth that God is bringing.
That's really good. When you talk about that victim mentality, no matter what situation you're in, self-pity is always just, a second away from temptation in terms of, woe is me, nobody has it as hard as me, my situation's unique, I'm alone in this. And, I think the enemy wants us just to continue to hang out in that, have a pity party instead of beginning to speak out on some of the frustrations and, work it out. So Lindley and I, when it comes to like our marriage, what we've learned along the way is how hard it is, but how important it is to speak honestly with one another about feelings. And it's taken me a lot of years because I'm a stuffer, and I will wait till it all just kind of stacks up and then explode. Mm-hmm. But that bitterness, which leads to contempt, Toni, it happens real easy for me. And so I think one of the things a lot of our listeners need to hear is just how important it is to begin processing those emotions rather than just stuff them down, begin to deal with them proactively.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the danger in stuffing, as you mentioned, is overreactions. And I think for anyone who's listening who sees a pattern either in themselves or in their spouse where there's just emotional overreactions, like, what happened was maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 3, but the emotional reaction to it is an 8 or 9, just way out of proportion. There is something underneath that. And I would encourage people not to panic if that happens. If it happens, definitely own it. If you're the one who threw a fit, then apologize, but then step back and be curious about what happened. Why was my emotional reaction so overblown? And start digging into what's underneath that. I think Carey and I both had to go through that journey. And what we discovered as well, I discovered this in particular, I had to create margin in my green zone, what you talk about in energy zones, Carey. The green zone for me is my morning time. I had to create margin in morning time to start to process, to meet with a counselor, and not to try to squeeze it into the cracks. Because I think we have this temptation to carry on with our busy lives and leave our work schedule the way it is and let the kids continue with their activities. And then, the personal growth that I have to do, it'll fit into this, 9 to 10 p.m. on Wednesday night.
Never happens.
You're falling asleep. Yeah.
I had a wise friend pull me aside when we were in the midst of our struggle to say that, hey, you really need to create some meaningful time to work on personal growth, to find out what's underneath all of this emotional storm that we were going through.
Here's 2 questions that we ask all of our guests that just kind of staples of the show is we ask, first of all, for you, what is the hardest part about living in the glass house? And all those years that you lived out in the public view as a pastor's wife, what was the most challenging part for you?
I know for me, I knew I signed up for it. Probably the hardest part, though, was when you really want some downtime and you're out at a restaurant with your family and you're just trying to be a dad, you're just trying to be a husband, and people come up to you to talk to you.
Yeah.
And that was way worse. I have a much bigger audience now than I did congregation when I led Connexus and before that Trinity and the small churches. But, sometimes I get stopped at airports and conferences and that kind of stuff, and that's fair game. But when you're just the local pastor, where can you go where you can just put your feet up and get a break from people? That was hard. For a while, I didn't even want to go grocery shopping because I couldn't go down 2 aisles without... We reached a lot of people in our community, which is awesome. But there was never an off switch. And it wasn't because, I didn't want to be caught doing something out of character. That wasn't the issue. It's like, can I please just be a private citizen? I would really enjoy that right now.
That's good. That's good. Toni, what would you say on that one?
I would say one of the hardest things was this perception that would leak out from people once in a while. And this wasn't just people within the church. It was also some of our neighbors, people in the community. They would say, oh, it's different for you. You're the pastor's wife. So it was as if they had put me on a pedestal that I didn't want to be on. I didn't want people to believe that we had a charmed life because we were leading the church. I mean, we had all the privileges and the honor of leading the church, and we signed up for it. Both of us signed up for it wholeheartedly. But I think it acted as a barrier. And it wasn't just from me toward other people. It was other people thinking, oh, you're in this different category. And there was no Zoom, like there were no virtual ways to connect with people at that point. So I just found that to contribute to being
It's like
isolated.
You're not a real person, right? You're just not a real person. It's like,
that's good.
We are.
Yeah.
That's good.
So the opposite question is, what is the best thing about living in the glass house for you two?
Best thing by far, having a front row seat for baptisms. I took that seat unabashedly.
I think getting to see so many people come to faith. And I honestly believe, I have thought about this. I think I'm a better Christian because I live in a glass house. I sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes I'll play back in my mind, what would I have been like as a human being if I was a lawyer? And I'm like, I don't know whether I want to know the answer to that question. Where might I have compromised? So I think it held me to a higher standard, and I think our life and our family is better because I get held to a higher standard, and I think I'm better now that I get held to a higher standard. So I think in the end it was a net gain.
The Glass House is a production of Lifeway. It's produced and edited by Angie Elkins. Sound engineering by Dale Sandberg. Original music by Robert Elkins. Photography by Rebecca McVeigh. And artwork by Heather Berzinski. We are your hosts, Ben and Lindley Mandrell. Thanks for listening.